Hello and welcome to the last course part of your module on economic and financial statistics, and in particular on climate change statistics. My name is Andrew Newton. I work at the ECB in the statistics department, and at a working level I help to coordinate the work that is being undertaken on climate change. I also, along with my colleagues in the ECB's Climate Change Centre, extend that role to other user areas and of climate data within the rest of the bank. My role in this short session will be to take a look, first of all, a reminder of the key points and key takeaways on what you have heard already. I will then take you a little forward for things that we know and are already scheduled, but also expanding that a bit into a little bit of thought about what could happen in the longer term, and then finally some conclusions on the whole module. So let's start with a reminder of why we're doing this. Europe, as Irina mentioned in her presentation, is the fastest warming continent. Climate change is no longer a matter of if it's going to happen, it's happening around us and it's happening all the time. Not surprisingly, EU citizens have demanded action, and policymakers using the Green Deal at the EU level are reacting to that. With every policy, you would hope that you need to fundamentally judge that policy on the basis of hard data, on statistics, and that's where we are coming into play. We are often seen in Europe at the forefront in leading that work, but global cooperation is highly important. It is rather obvious that climate doesn't respect nationality borders, and while we can collect data at a national level, often we need to see the effects across borders. At the EU level, there are lots of actors looking at data issues. It's not just officials, people like the European Statistical System or the European System of Central Banks. It is also academia, it is private individuals, it's private companies. We're looking at that, and we're using, at least in the official statistics field, traditional statistical data collections, as well as supervisory and other mandatory reporting. The idea is to try and fill the gaps which have existed and are existing for a long time. Now, how we're doing that, you heard from Arturo from the European Commission in Eurostat, and he gave you an idea of the broad-based statistics that are being collected and are being used at the EU level via the statistical offices and Eurostat. But not only, in other areas such as DG Agri, DG Klima, they're also working, and we work often with them. The ECB, with a natural focus on financial institutions and the financial markets, also doing our part. We have supervisory data for our supervisors looking at and prudential reporting, looking at how the risks are undertaken and being assessed at the banking level, not only for individual banks, but at systemic level. We also took you through some deep dives on how we're producing data that our own policymakers are using. They covered fiscal risk, the transition risk and emissions, and also our own sustainable finance data collections. We cannot be seen as working alone, and we do not work alone. We also need to consider the rest of the world, and global cooperation through the G20 Data Gaps Initiative, among other initiatives, is very important. And a reminder that the latest version of the G20 Data Gaps Initiative, version 3, 14 recommendations were made for further work, of which 7, which is quite a lot, are climate change related. So that's about what we've done and what we told you so far. However, looking ahead, we also need to think about what is for the future and what we know is in the short-term future. We also are aware there are lots and lots of potential initiatives, and we need to be cost effective and to look at exactly where we should focus. The overall aim is we're looking at enhancing the transition, the navigation to net zero, understanding the physical impacts of climate change that is already happening, and incorporating nature-related data, which is perhaps an area that is relatively in its infancy, but will become more and more important. Now, data are coming and are on the way, either confirmed and just in process, or under discussion. And while there are several systems, I think the three most important maybe are the update to the European System of National Accounts. That's coming and will be a strong set of data for use. That coming from the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, allowing us to understand the value chains and also the pollution approaches of different entities, mainly from the business and corporate world. And of course, we need to consider that all this data needs to be collected, and our idea is to collect once but use often. And at least in the ECB, one way that we're trying to lessen the burden is to look at work on an integrating reporting framework, IRF, and that will also include some data of immense importance for the assessment of climate change. Perhaps turning a bit more to what we would hope that comes in the future, I think one area is very clear that the location data that we need for physical risk is really important at present, as was mentioned by Goshka. We have data where we know who has taken out a loan and we know which corporate that is, but often the loan taker will give an address of the headquarters of that particular corporate. However, the asset itself may be elsewhere in the same country, maybe in a different country, and of course that has a different risk, physical risk than the address we have for the headquarters. We need to improve that data. We are also highlighted in the earlier presentations that one important gap is about insurance level data, how these assets that are under risk are insured and whether they're insured. We also need to address model limitations, whether that be financial models or the forecasting models in terms of where these physical risks are going to manifest or the effects of the physical risks. We need to look at expanding the emissions data to improve it. We mentioned that Scope 1 and to a certain extent Scope 2 emissions are already well covered. Scope 3 is an area which is both important and needs further work. And overall, we need to also take a good look at our own data and how we produce it and improve the quality control. To summarize, that the whole area will need continuous improvement. And that will include not only working within the EU, but also on an international stage. Perhaps a bit more futurology based, we also need to think about what could come in the future. How will we improve our own data sets? I see one large area where future work will be required and data will come from is increased data via technology. We already see pilot projects, perhaps from Copernicus, from the fire services, from Google, looking at using satellite technology, improving the collection of say, emissions data by collecting the data with sensors in the skies. But not only that, fixed monitoring of data could be envisaged from road usage, and you could see the amount of users on a particular road, how many times it's being used, how fast the traffic is being used, and you can imagine the modeling would improve the amount of data we have on emissions and areas like that. We also can see that remote sensing is something that is going to happen. Each of us almost will have a mobile phone. Currently, there are many companies looking at adding sensors for air quality, for instance, and improving air quality estimates from all those micro level data reporting is an obvious approach. It will happen almost definitely. We need to think about how and how to use it. Nature, which I've touched on a couple of times now, is very much in its infancy, but things like checking the amount of pollinators and that they're safe, looking at how we use land, how we can improve usage, fertilizer, etc., is a large part of the nature, and it will be something that comes more and more to the fore. Another item that is perhaps important is using better the data we already have. Quite often, statisticians have problems in accessing data, sometimes because of personal privacy, but because of some siloing of data. And that's something that is already under discussion, but will take time to deal with. And we must be very cognizant of what personal privacy means, how we can ensure it to make sure that we have access, but also the people reporting data are really reassured that their data is used with appropriate safeguards. Putting all that together, we can imagine in the longer term that we will be able to do real-time assessments, see real-time losses for banks, for instance. When a physical risk or a multiple risk happens, we can also target better mitigation measures by understanding more and more how these things all conjoin. Finally, and to put it all together, if we can just say that climate change is clearly not a transient topic. It's one that will be with us as statisticians for a very long time. We need to supply the policymakers what they require in enabling them to make good policy based on hard data. And it'll be there for the foreseeable future. This course module, I hope, has shown you just a small taste of what's going on. Maybe it helps you, it tells you how we're rising to the challenges we indeed are facing, and gives you statistical underpinnings on the work, and perhaps more importantly, to inspire you on the topic. Perhaps at some point after your master's, some of you will indeed be working on this and will be able to add to the wide body of research that's happening. Finally, one last word. This is a very new course. We are very open to the feedback on what can be enhanced, and I encourage you to contact me or any other person that you have heard in the last few in the last few presentations, and tell us, what don't you understand? Where can we help? Where can we make things clearer? It's only by continuously enhancing that we can make your life easier. And with that, I wish you well on your studies, and I hope you've enjoyed this module. Thank you very much.